Welcome everyone to a Canadian Highlander points change video. Today, Wednesday, October 23rd, the Council announced the change to 3 pointed cards, Thassa's Oracle, Wrenn 6, and Strip Mine. In this video, I'm going to be going over the 3 cards, talking about the philosophy behind these points changes, talking about the Council's perspective, some of the insight that they provided us on these changes, and talking about some of the things I think might happen in the future, looking a little bit forward into the future of Canadian Highlander. So let's dive right in. To start, Thassa's Oracle went from 7 to 6 points, Strip Mine went from 2 to 1, and Wrenn 6 went from 0 to 1. All 3 pointing changes were unanimous, so all 5 councillors agreed that these were the decisions to make. Starting us off with Thassa's Oracle. Thassa's Oracle is 7 points because it wins you the game, or at least it was 7 points, because it wins you the game when it resolves and you have an empty library. Obviously combined with Tainted Pact and Demonic Consultation, Thassa's Oracle going from 7 to 6 puts it a little bit closer in line with the other A+B combos, namely Flash and Time Vault, both of which are 7-point cards themselves. Thassa's Oracle lives in a bit of a unique spot because one of its B pieces, right, Tainted Pact, which allows you to clear your library, is a point. So this puts it as the A+B combo being a flat 7 now for the inclusion of it in your deck, which is similar to Time Vault and its untappers, and Flash with the Hulk. Strip Mine is the only pointed land destruction spell that we have available. The next closest in line is Wasteland, which repeatedly shows up at the very, very top of most played cards in most events. Strip Mine coming down to 1 certainly means it's going to see a lot of play. In 2024, basic lands have mostly, not entirely, but mostly fallen to the wayside in favor of 3 and 4 color decks. As lands continue to get printed that sort of push the limit on what is fair or what is reasonable, a decrease in strip is going to help combat some of those decks. This, of course, is going to punish things like the Academy decks, Urza Saga, of course, even shifting Woodland from Modern Horizons 3. This change also puts a little bit more pressure on decks that are playing greedier mana bases, so players might be forced to play a land or 2 extra in their deck lists and potentially keep more hands with more lands in them, which I think are broadly positive things. I think Wasteland being at 0 means Strip Mine progressively jumping down from 3 to 2 and now all the way to 1 sort of implies that the land destruction is a reasonable thing to have. As originally, I think the reason Strip was so high was thanks to Strip Locks and the ability to shut out monocolor decks. More and more, Wasteland and Strip Mine occupy kind of the same slot and do very similar things, simply because basics are not very popular with how free mana tends to be. The increase of Wrenn 6 from 0 to 1 is sort of a 2-pronged attack. The first is that by reducing Strip Mine and increasing Wrenn 6, decks that were already playing lands strategies in red and green, which most land strategies tend to be green, are not just getting another free way to very cheaply, very efficiently sort of strip lock your opponent. Cards like Ramanop Excavator and Crucible of Worlds both allow you to perform strip locks, but they are not nearly as broadly powerful as Wrenn 6 happens to be. Obviously, as a 2-mana planeswalker that does more than just returning Strip Mines and Wastelands, but also returning fetch lands, pinging dorks, and eventually winning the game if left uninteracted with. Wrenn 6, a phenomenal card in the 4-color pile decks and 3-color pile decks. It sees a lot of play in decks like Jund, in decks like Czech, Jeskai Green. The Wrenn 6 ability to essentially deploy a 2-mana threat and pick up a fetch land, which all of these decks are playing 9 or 10 copies of, potentially 11 if you're playing your basic land fetch, allows these decks to have really consistent mana and accumulate pretty incredible advantage. When combined with a lot of cantrips, it allows you to use the cantrips to find the gas that you need, that you are playing off of all the lands that you always have in your hand, thanks to Wrenn 6. So I think these are 3 great changes. I think Thassa's Oracle was a little overdue. Strip Mine is indicative of sort of a shifting in the way decks are being built, and Wrenn 6 is sort of the first step, I guess maybe the second if you want to count Fourth Yorlingus, but one of the first steps towards attempting to attack very high density, very high power, both blue-based mid-range decks and other non-blue mid-range decks in general. Spencer and Robin both took the time to write some thoughts. I think at least one other counselor mentioned that they were going to, but these are the two that we have for now as I'm making this video on Wednesday night. So I'm going to speak a little bit and highlight some of the sections that I thought were really interesting. So Spencer, of course, started off by talking about the comparison to Vault and Flash, and noted here that it's nice to have a contender for the A+B combo decks that plays a different type of combo control. Thassa's Oracle doesn't have direct synergy with A+B, with most A+B, or sorry, Thassa's Oracle as an A+B doesn't typically have much synergy with the rest of your deck. Time Vault lives in a space where the deck you surround it with is an artifact combo deck. It's an artifact synergy deck because that sort of layers really well. Thassa's Oracle doesn't really have anything that lines into it in the same way, where Flash is sort of your best fast A+B combo deck thanks to its very low resources. Thassa's Oracle typically wants to be surrounded by some sort of mid-range shell. Esper is very common, Sans Red is very common, I know I've seen Grixis spreads before, and so it's nice to have another 7-point combo that allows you to play some of the more powerful cards from Modern Horizons 3, for example, surrounded by your Thassa's Oracle combo package. One other challenge with Thassa's Oracle is that the tutors that find the A and the B for Thassa's Oracle are different. So you need to play cards that find both instants and cards that find creatures. It's somewhat challenging to play both when you have so many points locked up in your Thoracle, and so the decrease of this down to a 7-point combo hopefully opens up new opportunities there. I myself have already taken a look at one of my old Thoracle decks, and I think it's interesting to be able to play some of the new powerful creatures, especially Metamorphosis Fanatic, with cards like Worldly Tutor, which don't have a lot of strength outside of, to start being able to find powerful creatures with Miracle, and of course now finding a 6-point Thassa's Oracle. Spencer goes on to chime in a little bit more about this, creating these choices. One benefit to have a couple strong combo options is that it puts pressure on blue reactive decks to play cards that are more flexible. If you know you're going to be playing only against Time Vault A+B combo decks, you can sleeve up a lot of artifact hate without too many concerns. Having Thassa's Oracle be another push away from that makes combo players slightly more difficult, or control players' jobs slightly more difficult, which is, I think, broadly a benefit to the format. He also made a comment about Reanimator not being a combo deck, and I would argue it is a combo deck, but it's just a combo deck that doesn't win you the game. But it's hair splitting, so we can move on. Robin chimed in with Thassa's Oracle being secretly 8 points. Some people say it's secretly 8 points. I think Robin made a comment later on that his remarks were a little bit facetious, a little bit sarcastic, a little bit witty here. I think he's just saying that it's an 8-point combo, and I agree. It is an 8-point combo, and I think it's really hard to justify excluding Tainted Pact, given how strong the card is. It is interesting that Thassa's Oracle is the only deck that can really justify having 2 pointed cards as a part of its A+B. None of the cards that combo with Time Vault, like Voltaic Key, Tezzeret the Seeker, even 4-mana Teferi, none of those cards can really justify being a point unto themselves. But there are a ton of fair decks that want to play Tainted Pact, and so Tainted Pact being a point is kind of an important part of this discussion. And Thassa's Oracle coming down to 6, brings it in line kind of nicely. Robin also mentioned that this card wins the game, and I think that's important to remember. I myself was just looking at it, and even with cards like Metamorphosis Fanatic and that extra point which can be spent on an Imperial Seal or potentially upgrading a Mystical to a Vamp, you now have a pretty nice package there for the Thoracle, which I'm excited to brew on and to play some with. Deck is probably good. Both of them had a lot more to say about Strip Mine. There's a few things here that are foreshadowing, so I'm not going to dive too deep into them now. Spencer mentioned that he's a little bit hesitant about this change, but he feels like with the 2025 updates, this will fall in line. For now, obviously, we do have Strip Mine down at 1, which is going to improve the ability for aggro decks to put more mana-based pressure, which forces decks to play fewer spells and more lands, which means a higher likelihood of drawing cards that don't get them out of the aggro game plan of you just dying very quickly. Spencer also goes on to mention that creating these low resource games, players lowering their mana value. Yes, so the 2 to 3 mock spreads for fair decks to make some choices between fast mana, high value cards, and tutors. I really like this section because it sort of alludes to the fact that these high value cards are cards that have not typically been targeted on the points list before, and now you have a few more choices to make between the fast mana, the high value cards like Strip Mine and the Tutors. And I think that's a very interesting way for us to take the points list, and we'll talk more about that later. Spencer goes on to note that outside of the Victoria Metro, aggro does not do very well, which certainly from my experience tends to be true. I don't think I've seen aggro do particularly well in my local meta, the Portland meta. I haven't heard much from people playing on the Discord that it's doing very, very well. I think the Iowa meta might have a decent amount of aggro in it, but it's sort of two very centralized metagames in which aggro does well, and that includes a lot of pilots who are quite dedicated to their decks. Spencer kind of concludes with, if you feel attacked by the Strip Mine, you probably should play more lands, which is, I think, a good thing. I think having mana bases not be so free and so easy is something that is sort of hard to balance in 2024 when when we're not banning fetch lands, we're not banning triomes, we're not banning surveil lands, and so mana just progressively gets better and better and cleaner. And cards like Wrenn and 6 help, of course, with your mana base, and so putting some attack and putting some pressure on those mana bases, I think, is generally a boon. Robin leads off with some spicy comments about strip mining you and then he didn't play anything after. Well, if you play more lands, you're not going to have that happen to you. He does note that we like the decks like Mono Red, like Death and Taxes. These are important decks for the format. Aggro decks are important to the format. They are a valuable part of the Canadian Highlander ecosystem, and he comments on that here. And of course, he goes on to comment about the mana housing of 4 and 5 color decks. It's a good thing. He phrases it a question, but I think he means it's a good thing, and I certainly tend to agree. And he speaks to the next change, which is, of course, Wrenn and 6. Spencer starts off by talking about 4 color blue midrange decks. It is one of the cards that is most prevalent for 4 color blue midrange, and one of the cards that 4 color blue pilots identified as being one of the strongest cards in their arsenal, because it allows you to improve the card quality of so many other cards in your deck by focusing on using your ponder to find threats instead of lands, and making sure that your control deck that's trying to get to turn 10 is able to play a land on every single turn. It definitely stands out to me, it stood out to Spencer, and it stood out to the whole council, so I'm glad to see this one going to 1. The comment, he sort of concludes with this concept again about trying to avoid strip locks. The strip lock strategy is very, very powerful, especially if we imagine a scenario where strip mine potentially goes to 0 at some point. The ability to force people into either paying a point for their ability to sort of cheaply lock players out, or play cards that are worse like Ramanap or Crucible, certainly is a nice boon of the Wrenn and 6-1 movement. And he also does some interesting foreshadowing with, I think this is one that will look better once other cards are 1 point. Robin kicked us off with a comment about fair permanence. People apparently thought it was a joke when they mentioned it, and I think it's a pretty good card, and I think while some people might have been surprised by its movement up the points list, it definitely stands out to me as a card that's been a problem, or not a problem per se, but a card that's very, very strong and has been for a while. He comments again on this nice sort of strip down Wrenn up, creating a nice little balance in the 2 point sphere. But he makes a comment about, it's been a while since we've pointed a fair permanent, and this is a different pointing approach than normal. We will see how it plays out. So all this foreshadowing sort of leads to some comments about the future. Now that I feel the 2025 future updates will fall more in line, I think this will be fine. To make some choices between fast mana, high value cards and tutors, cards that will look better when other cards are at 1, pointing fair permanents, different pointing approach than normal. Let's talk about a 1 point future. I've curated a list of cards that represent the types of cards that they're talking about in this commentary. There are a ton of cards in both modern design, in the past 2 or 3 years, in the direct to modern, legacy, and all eternal format design. And this idea about pointing fair permanence cards that are value engines that are sticky, they live on the board, as opposed to the sort of existing philosophy, which is, you point the power, you point the fast mana, and you point the tutors, is sort of a new sort of push. And so I want to talk about some of the different options that we could be exploring. I want to start by making it abundantly clear that there's no way the correct path forward for Canadian Highlander is to point all of these cards. I think the correct approach, and probably what they're going to do is point some number of these. And there are more cards after this. This is not the only slide, for what it's worth. But I've broken it up into a couple different slides so I can talk about them. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why I think they could be potentially pointed, what the pros and cons to pointing them would be, and you can sort of pay attention to these cards in your games and see if you think they meet the criteria of being the Wrenn and 6 style problem. I have sorted these alphabetically and in no other way. So we're going to start at the top with a card that I think almost nobody is talking about going to 1, but I want to mention because I think this card's pretty good. Abhorrent Oculus is a fresh card from Duskmourn, which is essentially a 3-mana, is it 5/5 or 6/6? I don't know. I'll pull it up. Abhorrent Oculus is a 3-mana 5/5 with flying. And at the beginning of your opponent's upkeep, you manifest Dread. So you look at the top 2 cards of your library, put one as face down as a creature, as a 2/2 creature. So Abhorrent Oculus sort of builds a board for you and builds a bunch of blockers, as well as being a 5/5 flyer for 3. And the other one goes to your graveyard, which is a very powerful effect, as it turns out. Surveil 2, one of those cards goes to the bin, one of those cards goes to play as a 2/2. If the card you put in play is a creature, you can flip it face up for its mana cost, and otherwise it just sort of fills the bin. So it's sort of almost card selection. It builds a board for you, it clears the top of your library, and it's a 3-mana 5/5 with flying. The catch with this card is that it costs 6 cards from your graveyard. It's not like Murktide in that you can only exile 3 and pay a couple extra mana. It always costs 3 mana, and you always have to exile 6 cards, unless, of course, you reanimate it. I think this card is very, very strong, and I think it's going to see a lot of play in the blue mid-range decks, blue-red tempo, Jeskai, check. I think this is a card that's pretty phenomenal, and I would not be surprised if people identify its strength even more so than they already do moving forward. Barrowgoyf has stood out among all of the new Goyfs as kind of being the best of the bunch. Nethergoyf is severely limited by only affecting your own graveyard, which really forces you to, fill it up as quickly as possible. Pyrogoyf is 4 mana, and while it has a phenomenal enters the battlefield ability, it is only 4, and it doesn't have 2 keywords stapled to it, most namely lifelink. Barrowgoyf has lifelink. So Barrowgoyf's ability to oftentimes be a 3-mana 4/5 or 5/6 with lifelink is a massive pain in the side of aggro's world. It is awfully hard to remove a Barrowgoyf with red burn. You typically have to hit it with white removal, which is certainly a challenge for decks that are trying to put as much damage at you as possible. It's very sticky. It's got a very large body, and having that lifelink, of course, allows it to apply a pretty significant life swing, even when you're playing it somewhat aggressively, which allows you to take a lot of pressure off your own life total. Lastly, Barrowgoyf has a triggered ability when it hits a player, which allows you to mill a bunch of cards and move something to your hand. More and more cards in 2024 tend to play out of the graveyard, play off the graveyard. New cards like Flage, which is not on this list, even cards like Uro, also not on this list, allow you to really pay off cards in your bin. Even old friends like Snapcaster Mage, new cards like Psychic Frog, which is on this list. Those are cards that get better when you have more things in your graveyard to take advantage of or feed them. And so Barrowgoyf's ability to accumulate value, as well as accumulating life point swings, kind of sets it apart. Comet Stellar Pup is just a card that sucks. Not as in it's bad, but just it sucks to play against because it has such variance. I don't think that this card is powerful enough to justify being a point, but it's certainly strong enough to be in the discussion of, the top 30 cards in terms of threats that you play to the board and that do the thing that they're supposed to do. I think Comets fell a little bit out of favor as a lot of players have piloted to check, which is, more Grixis green, and the Grixis core becoming stronger with cards like Psychic Frog. But if we look at pointing some of the cards that are red and green, cards that are blue and black, and there's more looking back at sort of Jeskai style decks, Comet comes into discussion again as a potential option. One of the things about Comet is that it's not really that powerful and that much of a concern from a power level perspective, but more that it creates very unfun play patterns in the way that it can determine the outcome of a game via dice as opposed to skill. Sometimes you cast a Comet and it makes squirrels for a turn and then it dies, or it picks up a fetch land and then it dies, and sometimes you roll 3 6s and it runs away with a game. No pun intended. I think with Comet it's a very unlikely pointing, but it's a card that I would love to see pointed just because I want to see it less. when the council weighs whether or not they want to point a card, one of the factors that they get to weigh is whether they want to quote unquote soft ban a card, which essentially means that when it moves to 1, nobody's going to play it at 1 because it's not worth a point. I think to some extent Comet would definitely fall in that category, but it's not very fun, so I decided to include it on this list. Dreadhorde Arcanist is another card that plays very well to the blue-black sort of core. It's certainly a staple of the Czech style decks, the Grixis decks. It's a card that allows you to pay off both hand attack and cantrips. Essentially, that's primarily what it does, is it replays cantrips and hand attack for no mana. It's a very powerful engine. The first 3 cards we talked about are kind of threats in that their job is to kill you. Dreadhorde Arcanist's goal is to be an engine. It's to accumulate you card advantage every turn. On attack, look at the top 3 cards of your library and draw. Or scry 1, draw. Or surveil 1, draw. Or draw 1, scry 2. Or Inquisition of Kozilek. The ability for this card to accumulate incremental value every turn it can't be understated. It's banned in Legacy. This card is very strong. I don't know if it's the type of... I don't think that it seems to me that it's sort of on the lower end of the power level at this point. There are other cards that don't need, cards like Psychic Frog, which we will get to, that are just both threats and engines, and Minsc and Boo is a threat and an engine. Dreadhorde Arcanist is just an engine, is, I think, a little bit less scary than some of the other cards on this list, but I think it fits the category and is an interesting card to talk about. Minsc and Boo is far and away the most powerful threat, dollar for dollar, mana value for mana value in Canadian Highlander. It's the best threat. I do like how I gave everybody's full name: Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer, Tamio, Inquisitive Student, Minsc and Boo. They're timeless heroes, but they are not the hero of any story that I've ever been a part of. Minsc and Boo's ability to kill you in 3 turns is, from an empty board, is basically unprecedented. It has Trample, which makes it very hard to deal with. It has Haste, which means it's immediately creating pressure. And it has the ability to draw a ton of cards in a locked board. So Minsc and Boo allows you to almost always 2 for 1. It's very rare that somebody has an answer to both the Minsc and the Boo. And moreover, it just is, pound for pound, the best threat in the format right now. I think Minsc and Boo is one the counselors are a little bit less interested in interacting with, because they tend, I think, specifically looking at the Wrenn and 6 pointing, which is much more engine than it is threat. Implies to me that they're more interested in pointing cards that are engines than cards that are threats, which is understandable. A card like Minsc and Boo is the best card in your deck for any red-green deck that's trying to kill you as fast as possible, right? Anything rule-based wants Minsc and Boo as its sort of top-end threat. Decks like Czech are, in some cases, starting to eschew it. Issue? They're starting to stop play it in favor of cards that are more engine-based, because, as it turns out, you don't need a 4-mana card to win the game if you have a 2-mana card that'll do the job just as well. I still think Minsc and Boo is probably one of the easiest cards to justify pointing, just on its sheer threat level. There's no other card in the game that will kill you in 3 turns from an empty board with no other assistance. The card doesn't exist. So I think Minsc and Boo is a pretty easy target for not pointing, but we'll see if that happens. Murktide Regent is very similar to Barrelgoyf in that it's, for the most part, a dumb beater. It just happens to be a 2-mana dumb beater. Abhorrent Oculus and Murktide Regent are sort of two sides of the same coin. Murktide's a little bit more flexible. It's a little bit easier to cast. Abhorrent Oculus is a little bit more powerful in terms of being able to build that board and refill your graveyard. I think both are very, very strong, and I think at this stage, Abhorrent Oculus is probably stronger than Murktide, even though Murktide can sometimes be a 6/6 or a 7/7. The difference between 5 and 7 is a few turns, but not enough, I think, for it to matter when Abhorrent Oculus is able to build the board and refill the bin from the cards it took out. There's a lot of things that pay off the graveyard in this format. Did I not put Dig Through Time on this list? All right, we're going to talk about Dig Through Time when we get to Treasure Cruise, but that also should be here. Cards like Treasure Cruise and Dig Through Time both allow you to pay off the graveyard. Those are also common cards that are points in the blue decks. And so I think the time for Murktide Regent to go to 1 has probably passed with the existence of Abhorrent Oculus, but maybe I'm a little bit too gun shy on that, and I'm overrating the Oculus. But I guess we'll see. We'll see if the eye is good enough. Mystic Sanctuary is, I think only really worth discussing as a point when you talk about it picking up Ancestral Recall. Mystic Sanctuary's ability to pick up Ancestral Recall from a fetch land is outstanding. It's often been lamented or cherished that it's not the first Ancestral Recall that kills you, it's the second. And I would argue that Mystic Sanctuary is one of the most easily accessible second copies of Ancestral Recall that's available. One of the arguments that I think it was Impulse that presented it, which I generally think I agree with, is that Mystic Sanctuary incentivizes players to play fewer colors, because if you have to always fetch islands as a part of your deck, then you're more likely to be able to enable the Mystic Sanctuary, which makes your deck stronger. The one counter that I think there is to that is that if you're playing a blue base with 3 splash colors, say check, you're going to play Underground Sea and Volcanic Island and Tropical Island, and at that point you have all your colors and you have Mystic Sanctuary live. I like the idea of Mystic Sanctuary going to 1 because I think it would allow Ancestral Recall to begin exploring a down point. I'm going to talk a little bit more about down pointing the big 7 and 8 point cards later, but I think Mystic Sanctuary is a nice piece to look at when we think about ways to force players to make more decisions at the 1 point slot. I think Mystic Sanctuary, and the other one we're going to talk about later is Urza's Saga, which is another example where I think pushing players to go a little bit wider on their spreads is interesting. On the inverse side, decks that are already struggling, that are low color blue, for which Mystic Sanctuary is relatively free, a card like Blue-Red Tempo, it's always going to be able to turn on Mystic Sanctuary, and making those decks worse doesn't feel very good. But I think there's an interesting discussion to be had about this card, especially if they continue to print instants and sorceries that are very strong. One of the secret tech plays that I'm going to be playing with, that I was playing with when I was playing Thoracle, is Tainted Pact for Thoracle, fetch a Mystic Sanctuary, put Tainted Pact on top of your library, untap, win the game. We'll see if that play pattern is very good. It's a 50% chance of failure automatically, but it's a fun one, and it's an interesting part of the Mystic Sanctuary debate. Psychic Frog, in my opinion, is the strongest threat/engine in the format right now. If Vince Gamboo is the best threat, and I don't know what I'd say is the best, probably Treasure Cruise is the best engine, but if Psychic Frog is the best of both worlds. It has the ability to kill your opponent really fast, because you can pitch 3, 4, 5, 7 cards to it, and it becomes very big. It's evasive, just like the Oculus and like the Regent, and it draws you cards when you connect with it. It's very hard to interact with red burn spells, which is part of, certainly not the only reason, but one of the reasons that red burn is falling off is that it can't interact with some of the premier threats that exist here in 2024. Psychic Frog is certainly one of those. Lightning Bolts, Galvanic Relays, those types of cards are not going to do anything against the Frog. Psychic Frog also has the nice benefit of being stronger with cards that are less effective in your deck. So if you're playing cards that are more silver bullety and you draw them, they just feed the Frog, and they feed that clock against your opponent. I think Psychic Frog, in my opinion, is the most pointable card on the entire list of all the cards I'm talking about. I think you could very easily justify this card going to 1 because it just does a little bit of everything, and it does it all better than anything else. Psychic Frog lives in Time Vault decks, it lives in Reanimator decks, it lives in every single blue-black mid-range deck. The last time we saw a card that really transcended archetypes in that way, and I don't think there's any blue-black aggro decks, otherwise I bet it'd see play there too, but it doesn't make sense really to do that, so that's why I think most people aren't. The only other card that I can think of that sort of saw play in combo decks and sort of mid-range decks and control decks and aggro decks was 4th Aerolangus, and I certainly think Psychic Frog is in discussion with that card for being pretty strong. Ragavan is, once again, starting to fall a little bit to the wayside, similar to Dreadhorde Arcanist in the 2024 threats. I think a year ago it was a little bit stronger. Ragavan is the type of card that combo decks really hate to see, because while it's not a huge clock, it's certainly going to put 6 or 8 damage on in the first few turns. It provides mana advantage, right? Accumulated. It's not just like a dork where it can make mana the turn. It allows you to accumulate treasures, so you can continue to deploy things, and if you need to counter something, you can spend the treasures. If not, you get to untap with even more mana. It provides pseudo card advantage in that it allows you to hit cards off the top, which most of the time doesn't do anything, but sometimes it does a lot, especially as card quality gets better and better. If my opponent's Regavan connects on turn 2 and they flip a Psychic Frog and then they cast the Psychic Frog and still have a mana up, I'm feeling pretty bad about my outcome on that game. One thing in favor of Regavan is that it's much weaker versus aggro, and so it's nice to sort of have this 2/1 creature that does die to everything. Certainly a boon in favor of the cards staying at 0. But I think it's cards like Regavan and their density of them that really leads to cards like Regavan feeling oppressive. Like if you play a Regavan and you don't have a Psychic Frog or a Tamiyo or a Dreadhorde or a Minskimbu or a Murktide, you're kind of chilling. But if they play a Regavan and they have a follow-up play immediately following it, so you've spent your first piece of interaction and now they have another sort of must-answer threat, I think that's where things start to get really challenging. Especially decks that are trying to trade 1-for-1 on resources, like Jeskai, like Check, where you're allowed to just sort of lightly put pressure, slowly chip away at life totals, accumulate resources, and hold up counter magic the whole time. Regavan kind of does all of the things you want to be doing at 1 mana. The last relevant part of its text box is the dash. I've certainly died to dash Regavan, 2 extra damage at you, but I don't think that's too much of a consideration here. Tamiyo is another card that sort of transcends archetypes in a few ways. Being a 0/3 makes it a very good option for a deck like Time Vault in that it can block aggro. It creates clues, which makes it good for artifact mid-range decks. It has a win condition stapled to the flip side of the Planeswalker. Flipping the Planeswalker is relatively easy to do. You can do it with Recall, you can do it with Ancestral, and of course you can do it with Ponder plus Crack Clue plus Draw Step. Even later on in the game, you might be able to cast an Opt and then crack 2 clues and flip it. Tamiyo, of course, does pick up Recall the turn following its flip. It allows you to stall the board with its plus ability with the -1/-0. Tamiyo, to me, feels very high on the list of cards that we would be looking to point because it just sort of does so many things. It is a threat, although not a combat damage threat, but if you resolve a Tamiyo ult, you win the game, so it is a threat. And it is an engine, similar to Psychic Frog, similar to Minskimbu. I think people don't evaluate this card as being particularly strong for a number of reasons. Like I think a lot of people scoff at the idea that this card might be worth a point. And I think it's definitely much higher on the list than most people tend to think because it does do the threat and the engine thing really efficiently and for very cheap. Treasure Cruise, and there should be a dig through time on this list with the same pointing of 1 to 2. I think it was Jay Wyatt who mentioned, maybe it was today, maybe it was yesterday, that if you really wanted to hit blue specifically, Cruise and Dig to 2 would do a really good job of doing that. And I agree. I think that's a really good point. Treasure Cruise is Ancestral Recall at home, and by turn 4 or turn 5, it is just Ancestral Recall. Dig Through Time, of course, being a little bit more flexible to cast, being instant speed, it makes it within the same discussion as Treasure Cruise. It's one fewer card, but it's generally much higher quality cards, and it's the cards you need in those moments. Once again, this does punish decks like Blue-Red Tempo, similar to the Mystic Sanctuary hit, but if you really want to specifically look at blue mid-range and put blue down a couple notches, hitting Cruise and Dig up to 2 would put a bit of pressure on that. It makes me wonder if there's a world where, Time Walk, Cruise, Dig is an interesting point spread. With those cards at 2, I think they're not going to see nearly as much play as they do now. And I think Treasure Cruise is one of the strongest 1-point cards. I think it's the second strongest after Tolarian Academy, which we'll talk about later. But both of these cards are phenomenal, and if you want to specifically hit blue-based mid-range, this is kind of the place to look for those. White Plume Adventurer is another card that we're going to talk about for aggro. But White Plume Adventurer is kind of the only card on this list that's being discussed in terms of aggro, because there are I mean, if you don't have removal for White Plume, the other card, does it kill you in 3? 5? No, it kills you in 4. But it kills you in 4 for 3 mana on any board. And at two white as a mana cost, it's very, very easy to deploy. There are not very many games where your opponent deploys a turn 1 or turn 2 White Plume Adventure on the play that you win. If you don't have, you have to remove it right away, and even then they've taken the initiative on turn 1 or 2. White Plume is specifically because of its mana value the only one I'm discussing, but there are, of course, I think 4 particularly good initiative cards. I think at this stage, initiative is in a relatively healthy place. I think the initiative does create interesting game dynamics. It allows you to get more value out of cards that fly, retaking the initiative, playing around the initiative. I think that's an interesting component of this game. Certainly, this is before my time, but the initiative meta where everybody was playing it, I think was probably not very healthy. But at this stage, I think I can sort of take or leave White Plume going to 1, because I think to start, white-based aggro decks like Death and Taxes, death like, Boros aggro, they're just not very popular right now. And I don't really see any reason to punish them. And moreover, I think blue midrange is more interesting. They have enough threats already where White Plume is a liability more so than it is a premier top tier threat. Now that you have cards like Abhorrent Oculus, like Tamiyo, you don't really need the White Plume Adventurer to do the thing, because it introduces a fair amount of risk, and you're not trying to deploy things early anyways. You'd rather play cards that are generic engines that always benefit you. I think White Plume staying at 0 is probably the right place for it to be. But if you had asked me that 6 or 8 months ago, I think I probably would have said differently. Well, let's talk about what you would do to combo. Obviously, I just spent a bunch of time talking about different types of mid-range cards and engines and modern cards that push the boundaries of the strength of blue mid-range and 4-color pile and even non-blue pile. But control decks are what's supposed to keep combo decks in check. Combo is supposed to fear blue decks, for the most part, in my opinion. I think that's kind of the whole point of combo. If you're playing against an aggro opponent, you're just going to race them, and you're often going to win, because your whole deck is designed to break the game as fast as possible. Combo decks force you to play slower, if they force you to play fair, and if you can't get under them, you're oftentimes going to lose to their one-on-one and value engines and their counterspells. Balance is one of the cards that I think gives combo the most amount of game versus mid-range and versus aggro. I'm a combo player, true and true. I love playing balance, but there's a lot of games that I win because I have balance in my deck, and no other card would solve the problem that balance solves. I can keep hands on the back of, I can keep a Molda 4 because there's a balance, and I know that I can just deploy a balance, kill 2 creatures, wipe 2 cards, potentially hit a land. Balance is nuts. This card is a 1-point card. I often use the phrase or the adage or the concept that when I cast a spell, do I feel like I'm casting a point worth of spell? And when I cast a balance and that balance wins me the game, which it very often does because I've built my deck to have balance win me the game, it's a 3-for-1 or a 4-for-1 pretty reliably, and it feels like it's a pointed card. I would not be surprised if combo does not get to free roll balance in the near future. I just think it's not. We don't live in a world where balance at 0 is healthy for the format. Speaking to the Comet effect, balance also has the trait of just being not very fun to play against. Like if your opponent drops, land, Chrome Mox, Mox Diamond, pitch 2 cards, down to 1 card, balance you. Like I've balanced somebody on turn 1 down to 1 card in hand. And they won the game, but that's not the point. It's just because they top decked better and they had more cantrips in their deck. But that's not the point. When my opponent gets balanced on turn 1 down to 1 card in hand, they're like, well, I guess that was fun. That sort of unfun factor, I think, is pretty prevalent with balance, and combined with it being a massively powerful game warping, game winning spell, feels like it should really be 1 point to me. Chrome Mox is a card leveraged both by combo decks and by aggro decks, which gives me some hesitation and some pause to include it on this list. Aggro decks, of course, almost always spend all of their points on fast mana, because the ability to deploy a game-winning threat a turn or 2 or 3 earlier is sort of fundamental and crucial to the way these decks win the game in the modern era. If we ever needed to look at pointing a piece of fast mana that's not a Mox and not a Soul Ring and not a Mana Crypt, I think Chrome Mox is the first one that comes to mind. The first person I think I heard mention it, although I would be surprised if she was the first one, I think was Zoe, when she talked about Chrome Mox being a card that would be good to sort of put a damper in aggro decks. I also think Chrome Mox is just a really good card, especially for artifact combo decks. Mana Vault is already a point because it's a very good combo card, and if it was 0, it would definitely see play in aggro decks to help you ramp out those spells. And fast mana like Chrome Mox and Mox Diamond really live in that specific space, where they're abused by decks that are willing to sacrifice cards for speed. And combo decks and aggro decks are the two sides of the same coin, in that all they care about really is killing you as fast as possible, just through two fundamentally different means. There's an argument to be made, I think, that fast mana pointings in terms of hitting both combo and aggro at the same time is very elegant, in that you can kind of, two birds, one stone. Whereas tutors very distinctly live in the unfair combo world. So if you specifically want to hit combo, you want to hit tutors. If you want to slow the format down, you want to hit cards like Chrome Mox and Mox Diamond. Enlightened Tutor is the best unpointed artifact tutor outside of the One Ring. The One Ring is better, but not the One Ring, Urza Saga. Enlightened Tutor is the best artifact tutor. It finds Urza Saga to start, and it's 1 mana. I don't really think Enlightened Tutor is a 1-point card. I don't think it's 1 point worth of value, but I would be remiss to say that we could just nerf a ton of blue midrange with the aforementioned cards and not have to look at artifact-based combo. Both Paradox Academy decks, artifact midrange decks, combo control time vault decks, all of these cards are bolstered by Enlightened Tutor. It's just one of the best cards in their arsenal to find the greatest suite of options available to them. I think Enlightened Tutor could go to 1. I don't think it's going to, but it's definitely a tool in the toolbox if you need to take artifact decks down a peg. Contrasting with what Spencer said about Reanimator earlier, I do think Reanimator is mostly a combo deck. More and more, Reanimator is getting to play cards like Metamorphosis Fanatic, Psychic Frog, Baragoyf, good old Shielder the Apocalypse. There are more and more ways for Reanimator to play a mid-range game, and that flexibility has allowed it to really skyrocket both in popularity and in strength. If you want to make Reanimator decks meaningfully worse, they are all going to pay a point for Entomb. They all are. It's the best tutor in their deck. They tutor for Entomb. If my opponent end steps Vamp Tutor, they're going to untap and cast Entomb. That's what they're going to do. That's what they found. Hitting Entomb has the sort of splashy byproduct of hitting Underworld Breach decks. Underworld Breach, of course, would use Entomb to assemble the rest of its combo out of its graveyard. It's an unconditional tutor, so it allows you to find everything you need if your graveyard is sufficiently stacked. I don't think Breach combo is in a particularly sensitive spot right now. I don't think it's too strong. I don't think it's too weak. It could be stronger. I don't think that it deserves to be any weaker. If you hit Entomb, it definitely has the splash byproduct of making that deck slightly worse. Not meaningfully worse, but slightly worse. I don't really think there are any fair applications of Entomb, but if somebody can think of one, get in the comments. Similar to Abhorrent Oculus, my inclusion of Demonic Council on this list is potentially premature. However, for decks, more and more, the graveyard is becoming a fundamental, crucial part of what decks are doing in 2024. Demonic Council is very often Demonic Tutor. It's not Demonic Tutor on turn 1, but it's usually Demonic Tutor by turn 4 or turn 6. And when it's not a Demonic Tutor, it's also finding you a reanimation target, which you don't generally want in your hand unless you have a show and tell, or if you have a careful study or a frantic search to put it into the bin to then reanimate it. I think Demonic Council has all of the makings of a 1-point card. I don't think it is a 1-point card right now, but I would be astonished if this card does not become a card as a part of consideration for the 1-point list as one of the less powerful, but certainly still very powerful tutors available to combo decks. I myself brewed a Yogg-Will combo deck working on Demonic Council. I have not finished tuning it to where it needs to be, but almost all of the time it is a 0-point Demonic Tutor. It's a 0-point Demonic Tutor often enough for me to think, wow, this card is really, really good. I'm not going to speak too much on Mox Diamond. I think most of the things that I spoke to about Chrome Mox are applicable to Mox Diamond as well. I think the one key difference is that Mox Diamond rewards higher land counts and lower threat counts. Chrome Mox rewards the opposite. Aggro decks tend to want lower land counts because they don't intend to curve out on 6, they intend to curve out on 3. Combo decks don't intend to survive past turn 3. In both of these scenarios, Mox Diamond is meaningfully worse than Chrome Mox. I still think that it is still fast mana, it is still strong, it is still worth discussion, but I don't think that we would want to point Mox Diamond until we've had a good long look at Chrome Mox first. Nadu is a good deck that does not seem to put up results. It's not that it's not putting up any results, but I just don't see it doing anything that is so powerful that it really needs to be attacked or hit. I think the strongest version of Nadu I've played against is the Seeker Walk Nadu version, where it's spending most of its points on, Spellseeker and Time Walk. But for a deck that isn't playing 4 copies of Nadu and 4 copies of Shuko and 4 copies of Nomads and Core, or whatever else you're doing in 4 of formats, Nadu feels a lot worse. If you resolve the A+B Nadu combo, especially with like a Nomads, you're usually going to win the game. You won't always, but you're usually going to. But A+B creature decks are so much worse than decks that just win the game on A+B. And creature removal is one of the greatest type. Like, we have a lot of creature removal in this format. So this is the type of card that I would never stop looking at as potentially being a problem. But there's no results in my mind yet that justify this card going to 1. It's just a matter of, like, if somebody cracks it, if somebody figures out what makes Nadu broken and starts, winning tournament after tournament with it, we'd want to look at this card. But it's very much a like, well, let's look at it, but I don't think that it's where it needs to be yet to get pointed. Reanimate is, I think, one of the cards most likely to go to 1, and it's not necessarily because of its combo application, but because of its fair application. All of those threats, I guess not Minsky Move, but almost every other threat that I mentioned can be reanimated, and fair black decks are doing that. They are absolutely going, cast a Psychic Frog, oh no, you killed it, anyways, reanimate it. Reanimate my Barragoyf. Thoughtseize you, take your Barragoyf, reanimate it. This card is just it's very strong, it's very good, it's a point in Australian Highlander for whatever that's worth. I think this card's probably is sort of inevitably going to 1. The fact that it hits Reanimator is certainly a boon. The difference between Reanimate and the second best Reanimate is an entire mana. So Reanimate going to 1 feels almost inevitable as threats get stronger, as it sees more and more play in fair applications. Decks that are, Mardu midrange, Jund midrange, I could totally see them wanting to play Reanimate at one point. I think Reanimator might be the only deck that chooses to pay a point for it, but I think that's an okay place for it to be. The One Ring is a really, really good combo card. I've seen it played in Reanimator, I've seen it played in Storm decks, I've seen it played in every single artifact combo deck. And if you really want to apply the pressure to artifact combo decks, the One Ring is a great place to look. There's no other artifact value engine that does anything close to what the One Ring does, that synergizes as well with the rest of your game plan, like the One Ring does, and that fogs the creature decks for an entire turn. Similar to Balance, in that the One Ring is one of the cards I look at the most often when I'm trying to figure out how I win the game. If I put a One Ring in play and I buy myself a turn and I draw 5 more cards, the odds of me finding something that gets me where I need to go is way higher. Early ramping into the One Ring off of a Black Lotus in Storm decks is obviously obscene. If there's any one card that I think of winning me the game almost like the most often of all the cards that I can resolve, it's the One Ring as an artifact combo player. Urza's Saga, I don't know if I said that I think the card that is most likely to go to 1 and that deserves it the most is Urza's Saga. This card is a 1-point card. Oh my god, it is a 1-point card. This card is nuts. It is not because of it doing anything in any deck other than artifact combo decks, but it does do 1 point or 1.5 points worth of stuff every game that it resolves in the artifact combo decks. This deck is an entire mid-range plan in a box, and it tutors for free, especially in Time Vault, where it tutors your key, where it tutors the B to your A+B. This card is ridiculous. I think the Council is very much aware of how much Urza's Saga is a 1-point card. And the number one reason I've seen that it hasn't been pointed is because it is one of the best things you can be doing against blue midrange. If we go back and we decide that we want to take these cards here and move them to the 1 point, and we wanted to point some of these threats, you have to point Urza's Saga. You have to, because Time Vault's going to be too good of a deck. You absolutely can point the vault itself going to 8, but I don't have any reason to think that Urza's Saga, just on its merits alone, doesn't belong on the points list as a 1-point card. This card's ridiculous. Here are some interesting thoughts. They are mix-ups. Broadside Bombardiers is, I think, and I'm not an aggro player, but I think it's one of the best aggro threats, if not the best aggro threat that's available. Aggro is not in a like particularly good place. We don't need to make aggro worse. But damn, this card's good. This card's really good. This card kills you. The ability for there to be cheap threats that get thrown with the Bombardiers, cards like especially Fury or Solitude or even like a Murktide, that'd be neat. Wasn't somebody brewing Teamer monsters? I bet there's a Bombardier and a Murktide in that deck. That'd be sweet. Broadside Bombardiers is just a really, really good Magic card, and it kills people really, really fast. I think it kills people better than most other cards kill people, outside of maybe Minsc and Boo. I don't think this card is anywhere near a point. I don't think it's ever going to be a point. But if for some reason aggro is out of control and we are not going to point the fast mana that they're ramping into, I guess maybe this is a card worth discussing. I have on this list Flash to 2, and slightly further down I have Protean Hulk to 5. I think there are more decks that want to play Flash at 1 or 2 than there are decks that want to play Protean Hulk at 0. If you have played Vintage Cube, you know that there are very fun things you can do with Flash in Vintage Cube. Most prevalent, I guess, to this format is flashing in an Atraxa and drawing a bunch of cards for 2 mana. One really cool part of Flash is that it also happens to put the card you flashed into the graveyard, which makes it really good for Reanimator strategies. The point of switching or moving the Flash and Protean Hulk numbers would be to enable players to put Flash in their decks to do the Flash thing, with the cost of Protean Hulk being now wholly unplayable. Almost nobody's playing Protean Hulk at 0. They're definitely not playing it at 1 or anything above it. Basically, the idea is that Protean Hulk would be paying the price for the Flash Protean Hulk combo, rather than Flash paying the price for the Flash Protean Hulk combo. You can also flash out things like Academy Rector. This is something that I don't think is going to happen because it's somewhat inelegant. People are going to look at Flash and go, wow, Flash is only 2 points or 1 point? That's crazy. And then they see that the Protean Hulk later, somebody has to explain them why the combo is good, all this type of stuff. I don't think it's a very elegant thing. But in my opinion, I think it's more interesting as an enfranchised player of Canadian Highlander to be able to play a Flash in your deck that's not only flashing Protean Hulk. Maybe that's just the Vintage Cube in me. I think there's a decent argument for Flash being either 1 or 2 points. It's not a 0-point card. It's not a 3-point card. I think it's 1 or 2 points. I put it on 2 on this list because I think any change in this nature needs to be conservative. If flash goes to 2 and people try to break it and they can't, maybe flash to 1. But I would start with flash to 2. Caracas is a very polarizing card. It's a card that can be extremely relevant when it resolves by bouncing Tamios or Ragavans or blanking, your gut or whatever it may be, Lelias. On the flip side, Caracas is not a very good card a lot of the time. It does nothing. Many of these threats that we talked about here, the Oculus, the Barragoyf, the Dread Horde, the Frog, the Murktide, the White Plume, although don't bounce a White Plume, all of those cards are not legendary, and Caracas doesn't hit them. The question is, do we want players to sometimes have the variance such that they get to free roll an answer to their opponent's premier threat? This is a format with variance. It's okay to have some variance. Is that too negative of a play pattern to want to point Caracas? Personally, I think as Wizards prints more and more powerful cards, and because of those powerful cards, they continue to staple, because of Commander, they continue to staple the legendary creature super type onto those creatures. That makes me more compelled by the idea that Caracas should stay at 0. I don't think it's a 1-point card. I don't think that the play patterns are too egregious to justify. And Wizards is just going to make it a better card over time. And it helps keep some of Wizards' designs in check. I'm in favor of Caracas at 0, but it's an interesting discussion. Spencer, I think, alluded to, in fact, I think he explicitly mentioned Moxen as one of the cards that were on the Points Council's watch list going into 2024. I think there's a fundamental paradigm that exists with Moxen at 3 that Moxen at 4 would change. There was, I think, maybe it was Evan who mentioned that it's interesting to think about the idea of Moxen being worth different amounts of points. Like Sapphire is worth 3, Pearl is worth 4, kind of thing. I don't think that was the example he gave. In fact, I'm certain that's not the example that was given, but something like that, where Moxen are evaluated at different values because certain colors are better with Moxen than others. Personally, I think Moxen at 3 feels good. It feels right. I think triple Mox plus 1 feels right. What I don't like is the fact that double Mox plus 4 doesn't make a lot of sense. And that's not because double Mox plus 4 one-pointed cards is bad. It's that there aren't 4 one-pointed cards to play. A deck, like let's take Rakdos, for example. If Rakdos had 4 one-pointed cards, say a Barragoyf, Tainted Pact, Ancient Tomb, Strip Mine, Mox, that's kind of an interesting spread. Now you're using on-color mana, fast Moxen. I think Moxen are a part of the format identity. There's not a lot of places where you can play with Moxen, and Canlander is one of them. I think triple Mox spread is cool. It is interesting. It is neat. But I think Moxen staying at 3 sort of precipitates this idea that we're willing to point the fair threats that they ramp out. Otherwise, the format becomes a little bit more swingy by, did you draw the Mox? Well, yes. Well, no. As opposed to, well, did you draw the Mox and the pointed threat? Or did you just ramp out a less powerful threat? I think there's some interesting discussion there. Current day, I think I'm more interested in seeing fair cards go up and Moxen stay at 3. But it might be somewhat inevitable as more and more powerful cards get printed that Moxen need to go to 4 just because they are so powerful. But I don't think that time is now, at least not personally. I mentioned this earlier. Tolarian Academy is the best 1-point card on the points list. Treasure Cruise is second, but Tolarian Academy is by far number 1. This card is probably a 2-point card. Do artifact decks need to be given a massive slap? I don't know. I don't think so. But maybe they should. If we point a bunch of the blue midrange stuff and nerf midrange decks, which are supposed to generally be the prey on combo decks, if we nerf control decks, maybe Tolarian Academy needs to go to 2 points. If Time Vault is particularly oppressive, we probably want to point Time Vault. But if Artifact combo is oppressive, we need to point Tolarian Academy. This is a card that deserves to be 2 points, but it gets to live at 1 because people like playing Artifact decks, and Artifact decks are not particularly oppressive right at this moment. but this card probably deserves to be 2 points. True Name Nemesis is mostly an unplayed pointed card. If we went through and pointed a bunch of modern engines and threats, True Name could probably go to 0. This card is within a margin of error. I think True Name Nemesis is very similar to Barrelgoyf in what it does against decks. It just sort of sits there and blocks forever, and it's a clock that you mostly can't interact with in terms of like blocking it. I guess you can block a Barrelgoyf, but it's got Death Touch, so. And Lifelink. True Name Nemesis, of course, being unique in that it's virtually impossible to remove. You need Council's Judgment. I also don't think there's really any benefit to make True Name Nemesis 0 points. I think True Name Nemesis makes more sense on the points list if there's a bunch of other 1-point threats, and so you include True Name Nemesis in your spread because you're playing a bunch of busted threats. But this card doesn't feel like a 1-point card, just sort of looking at it. 3 mana, 3/1 with protection from your opponent. I don't know. There's no way blue decks should get to free roll this in the current world that we live in right this second. But if we punish blue decks in a bunch of other ways, and we implemented like 7 of those other pointed cards, I think True Name Nemesis maybe is worth talking about going to 0. True Name also has the negative play pattern problem, similar to a card like Balance or like a card like Comet, in that it doesn't feel very good to play against because there's not a lot you can do about it. But I also think Umezawa Jite has very similar play patterns in that there's not a lot you can really do about it, and it kind of wins combat by itself. I don't know. I'm not bothered by this card at 1, but I think it's possible we can mix it up and see it go to 0. All right, we've got some meat over here on the right side. Ancestral Recall, Black Lotus, Time Vault, Thassa's Oracle. Obviously, Thassa's Oracle just went down to 6. I think it could probably go to 5. I don't know if it needs to go to 5. Ancestral Recall is the card that is suffering the points of the threats that it is surrounded by, in my opinion. If you go back and you wanted to point Mystic Sanctuary and Murktide and Dreadhorde and Oculus and Frog and Ragavan and Tameo and Cruz and Dig Through Time, Ancestral Recall becomes a 5-point card. Like, overnight. You're adding 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 points to that deck. You can give them 3 back in Recall. I think that this format should have keystone cards like Recall and Lotus and Time Walk and Moxen generally lower than they do now. I think it is very fun to get to do the Recall thing in a format. I think it's very fun to be Black Lotus do something, you know? That's a fundamental fun feeling that we get to have in this format that not a lot of other formats get to have. If you play Ancestral Recall, the only other place that you get to play Recall in this kind of manner is Vintage Cube. And in this is oftentimes we're compared to Constructed Vintage Cube, and there's a reason for that. I think that's a play pattern that's fun and interesting, and there's no world we can move Ancestral Recall down without doing a bunch of stuff to the cards it's surrounded by. But I think the format would be a little bit cooler if the question was Ancestral Recall +4, 2 Mox +4, and are you putting, card advantage threats to surround? Are you putting card advantage to surround your Recall, and you're really just putting a Barry and card advantage? Are you putting, powerful engines to ramp out with Moxen? Are you playing Time Walk? I don't know. I think that's an interesting world that we don't live in that I think would be cool to see. If we go through and point a bunch of these combo cards, I think we could talk about Black Lotus going to 6. Right now, Black Lotus really lives on this list as a function of, I think, Lotus Breach and Yogg-Will Storm. Like, it's really Black Lotus does see play in some, like, red deck wins because they don't really have anything else they care about other than Mox Ruby. So, like, okay, I might as well play a Black Lotus just because it allows me to dump my hand faster. But Black Lotus lives here because it's a combo card. and I've played a lot of Black Lotus recently, and it's so fun. I don't think we live in a world where we need to make Lotus Breach a top tier deck, but Storm is a fun deck to play, and I think a lot of players would enjoy getting to play it if it was a little bit stronger. And if we were to start addressing some of these other cards that do see play in combo, and you were to hit 3 or 4 of these cards that do see play in Breach Storm, Black Lotus could probably go down a little bit. There's 2 other cards that get brought up when they talk about Black Lotus going down. I guess I can't think of the second one. I had 2 on my list that I was going to talk about. The first one of them is LED. That's the other card that sort of lives in the exact same spot as Black Lotus that is currently 0 points. LED could go to 1. For a number of reasons, I really hate that idea. I don't think that there are any decks that are playing Lion's Eye Diamond that are a problem because of Lion's Eye Diamond. They're all the unfair combo decks, and for decks that are doing wide spreads, Lion's Eye Diamond doesn't feel very good to me for that to be the case. However, Lion's Eye Diamond is basically Black Lotus a lot of the time. And it makes a lot of sense to be a 1-point card. Like, it fits the traits, the characteristics of a 1-point combo card. Yogg Will's down to 0. I like Lion's Eye Diamond at 0. If we talk about Black Lotus going down to 6 or even to 5, I would love to see Lion's Eye Diamond up. One deck that is particularly harmed by Lion's Eye Diamond up would be Slushy. So decks that are playing sort of fair breach decks with Gifts Ungiven and Intuition. Those decks are in a perfectly reasonable place right now. They don't really need to get nerfed. They would get absolutely blasted by a bunch of these types of point changes. So I don't really see any reason for them to need to get nerfed. But you don't really have any other place to free up some points for those decks. Like, you can't really put down Underworld Breach and Black Lotus at the same time because of Lotus Breach. Unless you wanted to point the third piece of the Black Lotus Breach combo, like Brain Freeze and the Mill Jace and, I don't know, Tome Scour. I don't know. It's kind of tricky. I think this section is really tricky. I would love to see Black Lotus go down. I just don't know how to do it elegantly yet, and maybe somebody smarter than me can figure that out. Time Vault to 6. Obviously, I'm the resident Time Vault fan. If you put Chrome Mox and Balance and Enlightened Tutor and Mox Diamond and the One Ring and Urza's Saga all to 1, 6 points on Time Vault all at once, you could take Time Vault down a point, for sure. There's an argument to be made, a fair argument, that why should artifact decks, broadly speaking, pay for the sins of Time Vault? And that's a really fair point. Artifact decks are fun. I think maybe Tinker to 2 would help solve that problem. I don't know. Food for thought. I didn't put it on this list because that's a ridiculous assertion. Tinker to 2. But if you wanted to make artifact decks that are not Time Vault decks better and punish artifact decks broadly speaking here, you could put Tinker to 2 and be like, okay, you can have Tolarian Academy at 2, Urza's Saga at 1, the One Ring at 1, Chrome Mox at 1, Balance at 1, Enlightened Tutor at 1, Tinker to 2. Your deck is worse. Your deck is meaningfully worse. That would probably keep it in line. I don't know. Interesting thought. As it stands, Time Vault is one of the best decks in the format. It is perfectly fine at 7. It does not need to go to 6. But it might be interesting to explore it at 6 and have more options for spreads if you were to point a bunch of the artifact combo cards. Last card on this list. Oh, I didn't mention Doomsday in the context of LED. And the reason I didn't is because if we put LED to 1, we would have to put Thoracle to 5 for Doomsday to even continue to be a reasonable deck. Doomsday, obviously one of the ways to get to Thassa's Oracle, and really the only other, well, I think there's 3 decks that I've seen that play Thassa's Oracle. There's the Thoracle combo control deck, which are the spreads that I've played. There's Doomsday, which pays off Thassa's Oracle as the win condition with LED to cast it, and the 5-color lands Thoracle decks. I don't really know anything about the 5-color lands, so I'm not going to talk about it much. Thassa's Oracle obviously just went down to 6. It's going to live at 6 for a while. We're going to see how it plays. I think it's probably still a pretty strong deck. I was looking at spreads, including Thassa's Oracle at 6. It seems pretty strong. It definitely seems stronger than it was at 7. And it might just be a 6-point card and be good to live there in that spot. Time will tell. Obviously, Thassa's Oracle went from 0 to 2 to 7 over its pointing history, so we're finally going to see it in some of those middling ranges. If you do start to point more tutors and more other effects, we could see Thoracle going down to 5. In the context of Doomsday, that's a deck I'm just super not worried about becoming broken, because if it does, you can just point Doomsday. So really it's Thassa's Oracle in the context of combo control that we need to be concerned of. And if the control part of combo control gets a bunch of 1-point cards, then maybe the combo part could be a little bit better without causing too many problems. I think this points change is a really good step forward. I'm very happy to see the council make so many alludes to 1-point cards in 2025. These future updates, now that I feel the 2025 future updates will fall more in line, I think this will be fine. Make some choices between fast mana, high value cards, and tutors. It will look better once other cards are 1 point. We're trying a different pointing approach than normal, and we will see how it plays out. I think, personally, the way that it's going to play out is going to be really cool for Canadian Highlander. The council is looking at a large points change coming up in early 2025. They need feedback on both this points change and all of these cards I mentioned to understand how the format could be shaped, how it could grow. I think with the ability to create nuanced and intricate pointing decisions for players in deck building, you are enabling players to have the greatest amount of autonomy and creativity in their situations. When aggro decks are almost always going to play some spread of Moxen and Soul Ring and Mana Crypt, they don't get to make interesting decisions about the threats that they ramp into. And I think that's something that would be really cool for aggro decks to choose between. I think it would be really cool for control decks to decide between low range control, where you're playing out your threats early and you're planning to rely on engines, if you're planning to play out threats, or if you're just planning to play the cards that draw more cards and you want to rely on a slightly weaker set of threats to make those cards shine. Keep providing as much feedback as we can to the council. This pointing decision, I've been very vocal recently about the ways that I see the format struggling. I think the format is struggling because there aren't pointed threats in this way. It's made Canlander less interesting for me. It's made Canlander less interesting to many people that I know. But this pointing decision and hearing this philosophy from Spencer and Robin, who are only 2 of the 5, and I know that there are more thoughts that I'm sure the other 3 will share with us at some point. Well, probably not Wheeler, but hopefully the other 2 maybe at some point will be able to chime in. And I'm sure they will. This indicates to me that they are listening and that they hear and that they see that this is something that people are frustrated with. And as somebody who is frustrated and has been saying it a lot, it's very nice to hear this coming from them, that this is something that they're looking at and that they're thinking about. So, get in the comments, both in the Discord, in their DMs, don't spam them, in the discussion of this video. This is a community. We get to make a difference. We get to say things and that they listen and that they read. And the things that they said today made it very clear to me that they are listening. And it made me hopeful and excited for the future. I think these are some cool points changes. They're all correct. I think that they were very deliberate in making sure that they made 3 correct decisions, which they absolutely did. And keep playing Canlander. Keep enjoying our fun little format here. We have a pretty special thing, and I'm very thankful to be a part of this community. And yeah, point, comment, stellar pub. Thanks for watching.